Okay, we might make a start. I think it's just past 1 o'clock. Firstly, hello and thank you for joining in. Welcome to the irrigation webinar series. Today's webinar is on the climate impacts of streamflow and future water supplies. It is actually just a coincidence that it's on the first day of the irrigation season, and I think some people would be looking at their water allocations and thinking, I can remember those days when we used to start the season with 100% allocations. Bring back those days. My name's Rob O'Connor. I work with AgVic based at Echuca, currently working from home due to COVID. I need to let you know that you have been muted and that this webinar is being recorded. If you have any technical issues, please contact John Paulette. John's details are on the screen there. John works with AgVic based at Tatura, but also working from home today. We do encourage you to ask questions through the webinar, and to do that, please use the chat function and select co-host. You should be able to see that chat box down the bottom of your screen, and just type your question into the chat box. If we're going to time, we will have a question break through the presentation and also at the end of the presentation. Questions related to the webinar topic will be prioritised, and we do encourage you to please fill in the feedback survey, which will come up on your screen at the end of the presentation. We're aiming to finish at 2 o'clock. Just a thank you to our supporters, being the Victorian Department of Environment, Water, Land and Planning, the different CMAs along the Murray River, Gob Murray Water, Regional Development Victoria, Plan to Farm, AgVic, and also to the farming industry groups that we work with to develop and promote these webinars. And just a heads up that our next webinar is on the 15th of July in 2 weeks' time, and the topic will be Irrigation Ag Tech, what's in it for you. Our speaker, Mark Sloan, who's the Industry Technology Coordinator with AgVic, will be talking about the different types of irrigation ag tech and Internet of Things services available. He will also be talking about the results of the Ag Tech Internet of Things farm trials that have been going on around Victoria, particularly in relation to irrigation. Also talking about the catalogue of devices, apps and suppliers of that equipment, and also covering the recently announced Digital Agriculture Grants Program that was announced last week. So that's in a fortnight's time. Today's speaker is Geoff Steendam. Geoff manages the Hydrology and Climate Science team with the Victorian DELWP. Geoff and his team work as water brokers, knowledge brokers for the water sector. They fund targeted scientific research and assist water stakeholders to better understand and better adapt to the changing water conditions. So it's great to have you on this webinar series, Geoff, and welcome.
Excellent. Well, thanks very much for that introduction, Rob, and thanks for the opportunity to you and the Agriculture Victoria team for the chance to come along and present to you all on the webinar today. So as Rob said, my name is Geoff Steendam. I manage the Hydrology and Climate Science team in the Victorian Government Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. And our work, it intersects with a lot of different people, a lot of stakeholders and a lot of different organisations. So we work very closely with a lot of people and organisations, including water corporations across Victoria, catchment management authorities, and of course Agriculture Victoria as well. So the talk I'll give today, I'll start with talking about a program which is called the Victorian Water and Climate Initiative, which is a program that my team coordinates and funds on behalf of Victorian water stakeholders. I'll then talk about a lot of the findings that have really come out through that work and also other supporting work about how climate's been changing and how that's changed our water resource situation, talking about observed changes and also then projections about changes out into the future. And then then I'll talk about how we can bring that information together about what we've experienced in the past, what we understand about the future, to then applying that to assessing water availability, so we can better understand our water yields today, but also our water yields out in years and in decades out into the future. So firstly, where I'll talk about the Victorian Water and Climate Initiative and where this a lot of what I'll talk about in the rest of the talk has really come from. So in the Victorian water sector, we've had a long history of investing in climate and hydrology water resource work so that we can better understand how things are changing. And so that started really in the middle of the Millennium Drought with the Southeast Australian Climate Initiative, shown on the left-hand side here, that had a number of partners, including the Murray-Darling Basin Commission at the time, Australian Government, and also New South Wales. At the end of that program in 2012, in Victoria, we continued to support research into some of the similar topics that were covered in that earlier program through the Victorian Climate Initiative. And then when that finished in 2017, the current Victorian Water and Climate Initiative started. And so on the right-hand side there, that shows the report from the work that wrapped up in 2020. And this report was released in December last year. And a lot of what I'll talk about in the rest of the talk today is really coming from, and a lot of it can be found in that report. And although that work is all, or that report is all based on the work up to 2020, the research program is continuing. So there is further work going on a lot of the topics that I'll talk about today. So just a sort of a snapshot of what that report looks like, shown here. You can download the report from the address at the top of the screen, or at the end of the session, I'll also include a link that will take you to that report. We have tried to make it as accessible as possible. So tried to make the language and the implications and statements all as clear as we can, to make it as useful as we can. There's also still quite a lot of detailed science and things that's captured in there too, but it is a package that tries to tell a fuller story around the research and really what we understand about the situation around climate and water resources with climate variability and climate change. So now just to talk about the science itself, starting with observed changes. So this is looking back at what we've experienced over past years and decades. And so rainfall is the main focus in terms of climate. It's really rainfall that's the main focus of the program, because rainfall's the primary driver of water availability. But temperature is also important, because temperature can impact obviously on potential evaporation and evaporation from farming enterprises, but also in the upper catchment too. So increasing temperatures can lead to greater water demands of vegetation in the upper catchments that can impact on water availability. So this plot here shows, so in red, the annual temperature, annual mean temperature for Victoria as a whole. And you can see there's variability there year to year. The black line is a 11-year running average, so it's really a smooth version of the red line. And you can see there a strong increasing trend over the more recent years. And so it's now been 23 years in a row where we've had above average temperatures. On rainfall and what we have observed on the rainfall side of things, this is these are six little maps of Victoria, and this is splitting out in the top row to show what's been referred to as the cool season, which is just the cooler time of the year. So there's cooler months from April through to October. So that's what's shown in the top row. The row along the bottom is the warmer part of the year, what's called the warm season here. So that's the months of November through to March inclusive. In terms of the columns, the first column here is essentially the past 23 years or so, so the period from 1997, whereas the ones in the middle are for the millennium drought from 1997 to 2009. And then the one at the far side here is the period after the end of the millennium drought. In terms of the colours, red indicates lower than average, whereas blue is an increase in rainfall. And so what this shows is really across Victoria as a whole, during the cooler months of the year over the past couple of decades, including during the drought and after the end of the drought, we've seen this reduction in rainfall during that time of the year. Whereas in terms of the warmer months, when we tend to get less rainfall anyway, we've actually seen in northern Victoria an increase in rainfall during that time of the year, whereas decreases in southern Victoria. And the changes there in terms of those reductions in the rainfall during the cooler months is linked to changes in the global climate, and so is associated with increases in greenhouse gas concentrations. And the Bureau has done a lot of work looking at weather systems and the weather systems that bring rain to Victoria and how those have been changing over time. And so they've found that low pressure systems and frontal systems that sweep across the south of the country and are very important for bringing rainfall to Victoria, particularly during those cooler months of the year. We've actually been, over recent years, getting less low pressure systems, less time with low pressure systems over Victoria, particularly during those winter months, and we've tended to get less rainfall from each of those low pressure systems when they are passing over Victoria. And those low pressure systems are a very important part of the rainfall for Victoria, of course, and it's that time of the year, the cooler months, when catchments with temperatures lower, catchments tend to respond more. And so the reduction in rainfall during that time of the year has a significant impact on water availability. The Bureau of Meteorology researchers have mapped out, they've gone back through all the past records over previous decades to actually figure out how much of the rain we've actually got over those previous decades from low pressure systems and frontal systems, as opposed to how much rain we've got from just thunderstorm related events, or a combination of the two, so low pressure system fronts with embedded thunderstorms. And so they've mapped that out there again, splitting it out into the cooler months across the cooler time of the year across the top, and the warmer months of the year across the bottom. And you can see that, and it's worth bearing in mind too, that it's the cooler time when we get more rainfall anyway than in the warmer months. But you can see that a lot of the rain we get in the cooler months comes from these low pressure systems and frontal systems, or a combination of those with embedded thunderstorms. So the blue and these darker colours being a larger proportion, whereas the yellow being a lesser proportion. Whereas in the warmer months of the year, it's really the combination, so thunderstorm events combined with lows and fronts, where we get the bulk of our rain across the state. And so what they've then done is looked at how that's been changing over time, over past decades. And so what this shows is a similar set of maps, but it's showing the change. And so it's red is where there's been a decrease, and blue an increase. And so you can see that in terms of so again, with the cooler months across the top, you can see that it's the lows and fronts where there's been a very big decline, and that's consistent across all of Victoria. In northern Victoria, there's been also a decline in thunderstorm-related rainfall, and also combined thunderstorm with lows and fronts over those cooler months. Whereas in the warmer months, when it's the combined events, that's the dominant source of the rainfall during that time, there's been an increase in a lot of northern Victoria in the amount of rain over time that we've been getting from those systems. There's also work that the researchers at the Bureau of Meteorology have done on looking at past changes in extreme rainfall. And I won't go into detail on this one, but all the work is available in the report, except to say that the work has shown there's been increases. And so when it comes to the annual maximum daily precipitation, there has been slight increases in that across most of the state. But it's more the rare, intense and more extreme and short duration events where we've seen the much bigger increases. And we worked with the Bureau to do a fact sheet on this, and so that's available on our website in addition to the information in the report. And that fact sheet talks through this and says how it's that trend that we've seen in those very rare short duration extreme events. We do expect to see that trend increasing into the future. But from a streamflow perspective, for large catchments and for water supply, that increase in the extremes is not expected to be significant for water supplies. It's really the overall reductions in rainfall that will dominate on a larger catchment scale. So now on to streamflow. So this is for streamflow gauging sites around northern Victoria. These are all taken from upper catchment locations where there's no significant diversions upstream. So the streamflow gauge record really gives us a good picture of what's the natural situation in those catchments in terms of streamflow and runoff. And you can see that the blue bars. So that's the annual annual streamflow. Sorry, for each of the years, based on the amount of the data available at each of these 4 gauges. And so you can see there are a lot of variability year to year. So we do have extremely variable climate, even more so when it comes to streamflow. Some catchments greater than others. What's also shown on this is 2 black lines showing the average over 2 periods. And so the average, the first black line is the average prior to 1997, whereas the second black line is the average after 1997. And also shown on there is a percentage, and that percentage is the reduction from the first black line down to the second. And so there's consistent reductions from 1997 across all of these 4 gauging locations. And when you look more broadly beyond just these 4 sites, that is a consistent story across the rest of the state. Obviously, there's differences though, with 28% at this gauging location on the Buffalo River in the Ovens catchment, whereas looking across at Creswick Creek in the Loddon Basin, it's almost a 70% decline there. So one of the questions that we're all faced in terms of water resources is that experience from 1997. Is that a permanent step change in our climate and water resource situation, or is it, and is climate change a part of that, or is it representing natural variability, and might things get better? And so it's obviously a very hard question to answer, but it is clear that it is a combination of the two. And in Victoria, we've been, in terms of water resource planning, we've given that a lot of thought over many years, and considered the possibility of this representing a permanent step change in our water resource situation. So now I'll talk more about streamflows, but I'll talk about what we've seen in terms of the relationship between rainfall or precipitation and streamflow, and how that has appeared to be, or has changed in a number of catchments across Victoria. So during drier times, and obviously during droughts like the Millennium Drought, we would expect with the reduction in rainfall to get a reduction in streamflow. But for many catchments across Victoria, that reduction was actually greater during the drought than we would have expected. And so what this graph here shows is a relationship between rainfall or precipitation and runoff. The relationship between rainfall and runoff isn't a linear relationship, but this, for the purposes of this analysis, the runoff has been transformed so that the researchers at Melbourne University and Monash were able to fit a relationship through this data. And so each of these points shown on this graph is a year of data from the available period of record. The different colours indicate whether the year was prior to the Millennium Drought, during the Millennium Drought, or after the end of the Millennium Drought. And for this gauging location in the Wanangata River in Gippsland. And you can see that then the relationship has been fitted to each of those separate groups of points, with the red being the pre-drought relationship, the orange the relationship between rainfall and runoff during the drought, and then the red is the relationship after the drought. And they're all overlay each other there, so that's quite a stable relationship even during the drought. So where if we got a 1,000 millimeters of rainfall, we'd expect a certain amount of streamflow as a result. Although what was seen in some catchments, and so this is for the Yea catchment in the Yea River, we saw that during the drought, with those orange dots and then that orange fitted relationship there, the amount of rainfall or the amount of streamflow that we got from a certain amount of rainfall actually dropped during the drought. So if we've got that 1,000 millimeters of rainfall, instead of getting what we would have got prior to the drought, we had a significant reduction in streamflow that we got during the drought. But then at the end of the Millennium Drought, with the floods in 2010, 2011, that relationship actually returned after that to this sort of pre-drought relationship. Whereas in other catchments, that relationship shifted, so dropped during the drought, and up to the date of analysis of this data, which is around 2017, that relationship hadn't recovered. So we're still getting a lower streamflow response to rainfall than we did prior to the drought. So this work was recently published in Science, which is a leading global scientific journal. So that was in May, just gone. It did get a bit of media coverage in different places, and so you may have even come across this being discussed. Essentially, it shows that some catchments may not be as resilient to changes like extended long dry and drought periods as maybe we thought. So what we've done is done an analysis at all the gauging locations across Victoria where there was suitable data to do this. And so the researchers at Melbourne and Monash did this analysis and identified those catchments in blue where this relationship was stable, the catchments where they shifted in green, but then recovered at the end of the millennium drought. And then those catchments in red that shifted during the drought and at least up till 2017 hadn't yet recovered to their pre-drought relationship. And so there's about a third of catchments across Victoria in this analysis that still hadn't recovered, shown in the red. And it is an active area of research. So there's further work that is being done on this. And trying to understand the cause of this shift. But the cause is an active area of research. It's thought that it's likely to be related to changes in vegetation water use, and so an increase in evapotranspiration, potentially proportional increase in that. That's then meaning that there's less rainfall that's able to become streamflow. So now I'll talk about future water availability projections. But maybe just before I start on that, obviously there's a bit of detail of work through there. I just wonder if it's a good point, Rob, to just check if there's any questions that anyone had at this point, and then I can work through the next couple of sections of the talk. But if there's no questions, that's all good. I'll just keep going.
Can you hear me, Geoff?
Yeah, I can.
Yep, right. A couple of questions, just related to a bigger drop in stream flow. I think in the Loddon catchment, close to 70%, compared to 40% in some of the other catchments. Do you think that's related to a lower rainfall in the Loddon catchment compared to those other catchments?
I'll just quickly click back to that. So it's I guess it is a more, so yeah, generally a dry catchment, more ephemeral catchment, more variability shown in stream flow year to year. It is, I think that is a common thing in those dry catchments. You do tend to see that bigger drop. So generally, I guess there's sort of a rule of thumb that's often used where, you know, if you get a 10% reduction in rainfall, you get a sort of 20 or 30% reduction in stream flow. But of course, in drier catchments, you can get to a point where you know that sort of general relationship doesn't really hold anymore, because if your sort of rainfall drops off to a point where there's just not enough sort of surplus to become stream flow, then you're going to get a more dramatic sort of reduction in your stream flow response, or the amount of rainfall that's going to become stream flow. So I think, yeah, so I think that is reflective of the more water limited environment in that in those respective catchments. Yeah.
Another question, if we can, just quickly, Geoff. There seems to be a number of factors that affect stream flow, including like the rainfall amount and the seasonal pattern, like the catchment conditions, particularly soil moisture, evaporation, and the different climate drivers. Is there a particular factor that we should be watching in terms of what stream flows will do in the future, in the short term, like over a period of months? Are there particular indicators we should be watching to get a feel for what Streamflow might do in coming months?
Yep. I guess a lot of what I'm talking about is more the sort of, I guess, the longer term picture.
Yep.
So when it comes to the sort of more the seasonal forecasting and the sort of more the monthly, looking out sort of on a more monthly time frame, there is information available, and maybe I can always provide this after the session today. There's information that the Bureau of Meteorology produce around streamflow forecasts over a monthly time horizon. One of the things that's really important in those is what we call like the antecedent conditions. So the sort of how dry the catchments are at a point in time, because then that's quite influential on then how if there is rainfall, how well those catchments are going to respond. But all of that kind of information is embedded in the streamflow forecasts that are developed and available. There's still obviously a lot of uncertainty sort of in those, and quite large ranges, because rainfall is really ultimately the dominant driver, and just depending on how much rain is received, that's a big determinant on the streamflow.
Thanks, Geoff. One more question, if I can. Is there any streamflow data prior to 1960, 65, given the 70s and 80s were wetter?
Yeah, so there is. It just depends on the gauge, and so DELWP invests a lot in collecting these streamflow records, along with a lot of regional partners around Victoria. And there are gauges where there is a longer period of record that's available, but there's sort of less of those, and so I guess it's there can be a trade-off between sort of length of record and then number of sites that have that length of record to get that sort of spatial coverage.
Thanks, Geoff.
Yep. Okay, so I'll keep on moving through the talk then. I'll just go back to where I was. So that was really all about looking back at the past, observed changes. And so now looking to the future, and here this is not sort of the monthly, sort of looking out over just the next few months. It's really looking out over future years and future decades. And the way that we have to do that is to use modelling, and there's a number of inputs into that modelling and different uncertainties that are all part and parcel of trying to make projections out over those timeframes into the future. And so with the first step is really, well, what does, in terms of future climate, with greenhouse gases being important for the rainfall received in Victoria, what are the different scenarios around how greenhouse gas concentrations might look over future years and decades for the globe? And so there's a number of different scenarios there, and they're all dependent on the pathway that the world takes in terms of emissions and reduction in greenhouse gas concentrations. And that can have an influence then on how the Earth's climate system responds, of course. And then there's models that model greenhouse gas concentration scenarios, and then how that affects the weather systems of the world. They're very coarse scale models, of course, so they do need to make them useful locally, downscaled to be a finer spatial resolution, to see get a better picture of what they mean locally. And then when it comes to water resources, we need to convert those climate variables like rainfall and temperature and things into what it means for hydrology and runoff and water availability. And these models are very good at getting, temperature, understanding temperature changes, particularly, global temperature. But for something like rainfall for Victoria, rainfall's much more variable, and Victoria only being a, relatively small place in the globe, it is more challenging. So there is a broad range of projections, and so a considerable range of uncertainty in projections of future rainfall and therefore future runoff. What this slide shows is work that the CSIRO did in 2017 as part of that earlier Victorian Climate Initiative that worked through all of that information to see, well, what does that all mean for the range of possibilities for stream flow in the future in different basins across Victoria. And so this is all based on what's called, one of the higher emissions scenarios, but we have also done it for a more moderate emission scenario too. And so showing here, so maps for Victoria, each of the basins against the scale down here, with red being reductions and blue being increases. I've also pulled out for the Goulburn Basin just the particular numbers for each of these. The top row is at the year 2040, so just under 20 years out into the future. The bottom row is for the year 2065. And then the columns, the first column is, when we look at that spread of results we get, the first column is I guess the more optimistic or the lower change end at the 10th percentile. The middle column is the mid result, so the median, and at the far side on the right here is the higher and drier scenario or result that we get there. So it shows that spread, and even though on the more optimistic end, you do see some blue there, so some increases. By the time you get to 2065, in a lot of the Great Divide, best case is no change, and worst case is obviously quite significant reductions in stream flow. So just for the Goulburn, I've plotted that out sort of over time there, just so you can see that it's really over time this increasing sort of drying signal that's coming through with results, and with the expectation that things would be drier, potentially significantly drier, but there is a broad range, so a lot of uncertainty, and we do need to plan based on that uncertainty, and there will always be a broad range of uncertainty in these kind of projections. But with this information and also a lot of the other work that supports all this, combined with the observations from the past, there is multiple lines of evidence that do give us confidence that the future is likely to be drier for Victoria, with overall less rainfall and reductions in stream flow. So just a quick summary slide here about some of the things I've talked through. So obviously, increasing temperatures out into the future, that'll affect potential evapotranspiration across the landscape. We've seen those reductions in the rainfall during the cooler months of the year. And in some cases, we've seen an increase in rainfall during the warmer months. We've seen in many catchments this shift in the streamflow response to rainfall. So then when we look out to the future, we do expect those reductions in the cooler months to remain or become dry still, possible increases in summer rainfall, but those increases aren't expected to compensate for the reduction in the rainfall during the cooler months, because it's really the rainfall during the cooler months is the time of year when we get the bulk of our rainfall, and with the warmer conditions in summer and the warmer months, that there's less of that rainfall that ultimately will make its way to stream flow. and essentially we do expect obviously variability. We have a lot of variability. That'll be the case into the future. We will get wet periods and dry periods, but it's just over time. The expectation would be that of an increasing probability or chance of getting dry conditions as we go further out into the future. So now I'll just talk about how this is the last section of the talk, just to try and pull together what I've talked through there about these observed changes, and then these projections about changes that we expect out into the future. And I'll work through just a bit of a worked example to try and explain how these two bits of information fit together. So this picture here is one of those 4 streamflow graphs that I showed on the earlier slide. So this is for the DELWP River in the Goulburn Basin. You can see here that the annual flow for each year and these 2 averages of the period prior to 1997 and the period after 1997, with, in this case, about a 40% reduction since 1997. So I also had there in the earlier slide just the Goulburn projections of change out to the future for this system. So how do we, there's percentages shown here, but it's not a case that we can't just add these together. And so to understand how these 2 pieces of information combine, it is very important to understand the basis of and the baseline, if you like, for these projections, so that we can tie it in with the experience of observed streamflow in the past. So these projections are not they don't use the past 23 years from 1997 as a baseline. They actually use a longer period of record. So going back from 1975, essentially to date. And so you can see here that that's about halfway between the 2 black lines. And so that's the baseline used for these projections. And so then to join those together, so this is essentially joining those 2 things together. So you can see starting from the midpoint of this red line here, the projections fanning out. And so that's showing there that that range that we expect out over future years and decades. Remembering, of course, that these projections are based on average annual changes in streamflow. And so we will, of course, get a lot of variability into the future too. And so the variability shown here will obviously will continue to get variability and potentially increasing variability out into the future. It also shows that where we sit now at 2021, there is this range of uncertainty around how much climate change is impacting our resource condition today, an increasing range of uncertainty out into the future. There is also the possibility that this experience that we've had since 1997 could represent a step change in our climate and water resource situation. I mentioned this earlier. And so in the water sector in Victoria, we have been planning for that possibility for some time. And so this is shown here as what's called a step change scenario. And so it is possible that we may never, that this could more represent a permanent change since 1997. And so we do have to be prepared for that possibility. And the work I talked through about those shifts in rainfall response, runoff response, to rainfall, highlights the need to take that scenario seriously. And so all that work and the projections and how it ties into the records that we have available from the past is all described in a set of guidance that we released late last year, based on all the science available. And that was provided to water resource modelers and practitioners across Victoria. It's available on the website. And so water resource assessments can use that set of guidance in a consistent way to do water resource assessments across Victoria. Because I guess when it comes to assessing how climate change might impact on a particular water product, there is very complex models that do need to build in the information I've talked about today, with all of the water sharing rules, allocation rules, and demand patterns to then understand how these changes in upper catchment water availability play out in water supply systems. And so just some further links here for more information. So I've got here the link at the top to the report that I've been referring to. The team also has a newsletter we put out from time to time to update stakeholders and anyone interested on the program and like to join the newsletter. You can email the team at that address and we'll add you to our newsletter list. Last year we ran a series of webinars on the different research topics within the Victorian Water and Climate Initiative. And so if there's any particular topics that I've talked through today, there's a good chance that one of the recorded webinars from last year might cover it. And so you'll hear from the scientists themselves talking through their work and the findings. And so they're available there. And there was also a recorded webinar from earlier this year where we had the scientists, lead scientists come along and talk through the different components of the report that we released in December. And so that's available there in that list of recorded webinars, and a link there to the guidelines I just mentioned. And then just some further links, particularly on the climate side, if you had a particular interest on the climate side of things. There's just some other links here to things that you may find useful or relevant. So that was my last slide there, Rob. And thanks everyone for listening. And I should say too, all of this work, there's many people that have contributed and many organisations too that have contributed to all this work over the years. And so obviously the CSIRO, Bureau of Meteorology, Melbourne and Monash universities, and lots of individuals. So we really appreciate all of their work and all of the supportive stakeholders across the Victorian water sector.
Thanks, Geoff. Really appreciate the honesty in the presentation and the use of science-based information. There is quite some sobering messages there, and I don't really know that there would be too many surprises there for many people. I think for the last 20 odd years, we've been facing changing climate conditions and have been adapting our irrigation systems and our farms in line with those changing conditions, and from what you're saying, we'll continue to do that. Yeah, just there has been quite a few questions come in. So you spoke briefly, Geoff, about some of the changes in the climate drivers, like the low pressure systems and the fronts, and even the thunderstorms. There are other climate drivers like the Indian Ocean dipole and the ENSO, for example, even the southern annual mode. Are there bigger changes that are happening in relation to the climate drivers, over that sort of 20-year period that are driving some of those climate drivers?
Yeah, so maybe just to respond to two sort of bits of that question. So I guess on the lows and the fronts and the thunderstorms, I suppose they're more sort of weather systems that bring our rain locally. Whereas I guess some of those drivers you mentioned, so like ENSO, Southern Annular Mode, the Indian Ocean Dipole, things like that, they're more indicators more broadly around around the climate, and so I guess it's worth sort of separating those two out. But in terms of those climate drivers like ENSO and things like that, there's all of those are really embedded in the results I've talked through there with the projection. So all of the global climate models do model all of those climate drivers. So that's all part of the global climate system that is being captured within those models.
Yep. Okay.
So and I guess to continue on that. So then I guess that experience of the past 20 years, there can be longer term fluctuations, in climate that we can experience, and then what we've experienced over recent years, obviously will reflect all of the different states those different climate drivers are in. And so variability is a big thing, and obviously we get variability over different time scales. But it is the case that climate change, there's work that does show the experience we have had is partly the result of increasing greenhouse gas concentrations. But of course, variability is a big thing too, and so the Millennium Drought will be a combination of both variability and including variability with those climate drivers you talked about, in combination with increases in greenhouse gas concentrations.
Thanks, Geoff. Another question. Some people will talk about the experience in southern Western Australia as a bit of a case study for what might happen here in Victoria, given that the changes in streamflows and water supplies in Western Australia seem to commence in the 1970s, perhaps 20 or 25 years before it seemed to commence here. Do you place much value on watching what's happening in Western Australia as a guide to what might happen here in Victoria?
I would say, we've stakeholders in Victoria and people working in the water sector have been looking closely at that experience in southwest Western Australia for a long time, and there's sort of potentially multiple step changes that have been experienced over there, and wondering, is it the case that we're just sort of 2 decades following them, sort of two decades later. So I guess we don't really know the answer to that, as to the best of my knowledge, but and there would be people at the Bureau of Meteorology who would be better able to answer those kind of questions. But one of the things to keep in mind is that the rainfall that we get in Victoria, there's more types of weather systems that bring rain to Victoria than is the case for southwest Western Australia. So those low pressure and frontal systems are the dominant source of rainfall, more so for southwest WA than is the case for Victoria, because for parts of Victoria there's more things at play, including east coast lows and things like that. So there's more potential sources, as I understand it, of rainfall that we have in Victoria than in WA, which potentially might mean we're sort of less vulnerable. But like I say, that would be a question better answered by the researchers at the Bureau.
Thanks, Geoff. Another couple of specific questions, and I think it's referring to the Streamflow data. Does the analysis consider other diversion from the system that affects Streamflow?
So it does. I guess the those 4 maps that I showed of Streamflow, so they're basically gauges that they're quite high up in the catchment. So there's no sort of significant diversions really occurring above those locations. So there's no large storages or big diversions or anything like that. There might be some some smaller domestic and stock diversions and things, but generally those gauges are essentially a natural flow record that we're seeing there. The analysis I talked about, where I had the map of Victoria with the different sort of catchments with the red and the green and the blue. The team did work through looking at all of those catchments to check if there were particularly significant diversions in those. And obviously there is a level of diversions in some of those catchments, but there was no larger diversions that were considered to affect the analysis. And it's also worth noting too that like amongst that map of different gauge catchments where those analyses were done, there's catchments there that there really is no diversions at all. Natural catchments, forested, no farm dams, anything, and we're seeing the same kind of changes in some of those catchments too.
Thanks, Geoff. Another question. What is the reason for picking 1997 as a split point in the data?
It's really because, well, I guess that was the start of the Millennium Drought, and so that's really where there was a big change that we observed in rainfall, but also in streamflow. And so it's really just a pragmatic one. The Bureau of Meteorology do have applied, and it's available on their website. They've applied different mathematical functions to try and determine, split points, or points where there's been a mathematically significant shift, and so it really is that's the point where there was a significant shift, and that's confirmed by those kind of analyses.
Thanks, Geoff. So this one relates to the extremes, I suppose, and I guess there's, like, we talk about extremes on certainly on the plains here as different to up in the upper catchments. So, over the last 20 years, we've seen extremes. Well, it would it would seem that we've had our fair share of drought years, and we've had our fair share of wet years. And I think some people would say in the last 20 odd years we've probably had more of those extremes perhaps than the previous 100 years. So I suppose is that a fair observation that we are getting more of those extremes, and so I guess separating out the temperature, rainfall as a little bit different to hydrology, do you think they'll continue into the future?
So yeah, I guess I guess I can only really talk to the work that was done in this initiative, and so it was really on, I guess, rainfall extremes, and they did look at different periods. So looking at like the maximum days rainfall in any year, and so that was one of the maps that I showed there. And they also then looked at rainfall pluvio gauge records that have quite fine time step sort of records of rainfall and rainfall intensity, and that go back sort of many years. But there's very few of those long records of pluvio gauges around. But there was a lot of work done to do extract as much data as could be done for that purpose. And the results did show that it was very much the sort of those short duration and much rarer, kind of more extreme events, where in some locations there had been a significant increase, and I think it was even a bit more. Well, it was sort of more sort of the northwest of the state, but then yeah, it did vary quite a bit spatially. But there's not many of those long records. But so I guess it depends on what kind of extreme that you're talking about, because it's sort of, if you're talking multi-day kind of rainfall events, then I'm not sure that at least the analysis done there necessarily sort of supports that change. But because at least at the daily annual maximum daily rainfall, that there was only a sort of a relatively small shift there, increase in that extreme. I guess with extremes, it can depend on other variables and things. Like if you were to look at sort of temperature extremes, then with increasing temperatures, in terms of hitting certain extreme thresholds, the changes can sort of be much more apparent than just sort of gradual changes. But it just depends a bit on what extreme and how you're defining the extreme.
Okay, thanks, Geoff. I just noted that it's just past 2 o'clock, and with your permission, I might wind it up, but there's still a few questions that remain unanswered. So if your head's not absolutely spinning, we might wind it up for those people who would like to go, but let those people go and then continue with these questions if you think you can manage that.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Yeah. So I'll just I'll wind it up and just remind people if they could complete the that feedback form on your screen, that would be great. It should only take about 60 seconds. And just a reminder about the webinar in a fortnight's time on ag technology, particularly in light of the recently announced Victorian digital agriculture grant scheme. So thanks very much to Geoff. Very informative presentation, and a very done well, I reckon, Geoff, with very complicated, and you've come out with some pretty simple messages, I reckon. So thanks very much for that. Thanks to John for his technical support behind the scenes, and thanks for everyone for joining in and being part of the webinar, and for your questions. I hope you got something out of it, and have a good afternoon. So feel free to hang up and head off, but we'll just answer a few more questions for those people that have sent questions in. Is there a plan, Geoff, to refine the models in the higher elevation runoff zones, as these zones appear to experience greater climate change?
So was that higher elevation, did you say, Rob?
Yeah. Is there a plan to refine the models in the higher elevation runoff zones?
Yep. So I guess it's in terms of that issue of the sort of shift in the relationship that I talked through. It was actually the more those higher elevation ones that in the Great Divide there, that at least in the sort of more eastern part of the Great Divide, that were more stable. Yeah, and so, and I guess there's a lot of that data was more based on sort of streamflow gauges rather than necessarily the models themselves. So it might depend on kind of what models that the question's sort of asking about, perhaps, like, yeah, because I guess there's sort of yeah, I guess there's rainfall runoff models, for example, that that exist in different places for different purposes. But I guess I'm not sure there's necessarily, for the things I talked through, whether there's a need to sort of update models in the high elevation areas, but there might be. I might not have quite got to the nub of the question, perhaps.
No, that's good. Thanks, Geoff. Just a question on water quality. Like we've seen, or have we seen changes in water quality associated with the reduced stream flows? And do you think there might be a future stream flow trigger where water quality might become more of an issue in the future?
So I would say that's, yeah, going quite a bit beyond the things my expertise and what I could really talk to. But yeah, good question. There's obviously a relationship, or there can be, for different water quality things, between the volume of stream flow and then water quality. But yeah, there's a lot of complexity in terms of even understanding water quality, different water quality parameters and risks, and how they might change over time. But certainly I appreciate that it is a really important question, but just not one I'm really able to sort of provide much advice on. I guess there's being a whole range of water quality things. There's obviously sort of bushfire related water quality challenges as well. Yeah, so it's there's probably not much I can really add more than that, but it's a very good question.
Yep, and there is a question there about the impact of bushfires and forestry and clearing on runoff and stream flows.
Yep. So in terms of bushfires, we've had a lot of what you might call kind of mega fires over a number of years now. So in 2003, the Alpine fires, over 1 million hectares. So 506, over 1 million hectare fire, Great Divide fire, and then obviously the 09 fires and the recent fires. So yeah, there's I guess in terms of the water yield questions of how fires can affect water yields, there has been work done on that, and more work being done on that to better understand that. It does relate to I guess the water use of the forest immediately after a fire, depending the vegetation. There's less leaf area. The evapotranspiration of the forested catchments tends to be much or significantly lower than prior to the fire. But then over time, as the forest recovers, then the runoff can return to something more like similar to what it was prior to the fire, depending on the forest type. So some tree species can be killed by even moderate fire, and then regrow by seed. So mountain ash and alpine ash, for example. And so if you have a situation where the fire is intense enough that those forests are killed and then regrow from seed, then can be times during its regrowth where the water use can even be exceed the water use of the forest prior to the fire. but then there is a lot of questions around, well, fire frequency and obviously we have had a number of big fires over recent years, and some of those have burnt the same area more than once. And so then with climate change, obviously increasing temperatures, and so unfortunately that fire risk is increasing in the future. So how all that comes together and what that means for water quantity and water yields is quite complex. And so it's not, so I guess understanding, does that mean it's going to be a significant decline in water yields or not? I think still needs a bit of work to pull together to provide a clearer answer. Was that sort of what the question was about, or did it get into water quality?
Yeah, I think you nailed it quite well there, Geoff. That was pretty comprehensive answer. Thank you. Just two more questions if we can, Geoff. How important are greenhouse gas emissions in terms of their impact on future stream flows?
So I guess it's concentrations. Like it's ultimately it's about greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere, and obviously emissions are what are increasing those concentrations in the atmosphere. Then of course there's actions that we can do to actually draw in greenhouse gases, particularly carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, that can then reduce or help to put a downward pressure on those concentrations. So they are obviously the greenhouse gas concentrations are the big driver of the projections, the declines in the projections that we see, and those declines are significant, very significant for our part of the world. Not necessarily the case in some other parts of the world, but certainly for the mid-latitudes where we are, it has a big influence, and so it is a big deal.
Thanks, Geoff. One last one. What are the links of your work in the hydrology and climate science team in DELWP with the Northern Region Sustainable Water Strategy? Who is responsible for producing the Northern Region Sustainable Water Strategy?
Yeah, so the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning works to support the Minister in the Water Act, and the Sustainable Water Strategies is one of the things within the Water Act, and so it is the department at the Northern Region Sustainable Water Strategy, I think, was done in 2006. So in terms of another Northern Region Sustainable Water Strategy, as I understand, there's no sort of timing around that at this point. And so I guess in terms of connections of this work, obviously a lot of the stuff I've talked about feeds into many things that we do, including sustainable water strategies. And so when another Northern Region Sustainable Water Strategy is done, a lot of the stuff I talk through is very much forms an important evidence base and part of the information that a strategy like that would consider.
Fantastic. Thanks, Geoff. I think you're off the hook now.
Okay, great.
But thanks very much again, and for the presentation and answering all of those questions. We grilled you for an extra 15 minutes that was beyond the contract.
No worries at all, and thanks to you and the team for the opportunity to do it, and thanks to all your stakeholders for listening. I'm conscious there's a lot of detail in there, but yeah, I guess just did my best to give a sort of overview of all of that, but plenty of other information people can drill into if they've got interest in particular things.
Fantastic. Thanks, Geoff. Yeah, have a good afternoon and look forward to catching up in the future.
Great,
And
thank you.
thanks to all those people who sat in and listened to the questions. We hope we've answered all of your questions. Thank you. See you, Geoff. See you, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Rob.